Can hear you loud and clear.
Morning. Thank you. And good morning to our colleagues from Parliament, and good morning to the team from the Auditor General of South Africa. Today, we receive a briefing on PRASA by the Auditor General ahead of our discussion with them uh, coming up soon. So I would like to ask the Auditor General team to just introduce themselves, introduce the team, at least the people that will be speaking, and then I would like to hand over to you to take us through your briefing document. It has been sent to members ahead of time, yeah, but of course it would be useful to have it up on the screen so that we can follow your explanation. And then once you are done with your presentation, we will take the members' questions of clarity on the presentation. Thank you very much. May I hand over to you?
Good morning, Honourable Chair and Honourable Members. Thank you so much for having us. My name is Cornay Meiberg. I'm the Business Unit Leader responsible for, amongst others, the transport portfolio. I'll allow the team that's going to do the presentation in the main, maybe Ilse and Sisbe, just to introduce themselves so that you can also see their face. And thereafter, I'll then take back. Thank you so much.
Good morning, Chairperson. I am Sizwe Malo, the Deputy Business Unit Leader in the Business Unit responsible for PRASA. Thanks, Chair.
And thank you very much, Chairperson. I'm Ilse Dippenaar. I'm the Senior Manager responsible for the PRASA audit, and I will be the one taking us through the presentation. Chair, I did note that I do not have the ability to share my screen. So perhaps if the company or the committee secretary can just give us the right to share the presentation, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Yes, no, it will be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. While Ilse is sorting out the presentation, you did hand back to us, so maybe I can just do a couple of opening remarks.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Thanks while we sort out the presentation. Thank you so much for this invitation for us today to come and present the 24-25 audit outcomes of the PRASA audit that we conducted last year. I think from the couple of previous years, we did see that PRASA had either disclaimer opinions or qualified audit outcomes. For the 24-25 audit year, PRASA managed to improve the audit outcome, and they actually received the unqualified audit opinion. They also managed to submit their financial statements on time. Though we saw some improvements, we also noted that there is still areas that require some improvement, especially in terms of the compliance. There were also still some findings that we found on the financial statements that had to be corrected to get them to this point of being unqualified. But I think the purpose for today is then really for Ilse, through the presentation, to take the committee through in a bit more detail, and where we can explain some of the root causes, the observations, and also share some recommendations in terms of the way forward, so that PRASA at the end of the day can also be seen as an entity that embraced culture shift, where there is performance, accountability, transparency, and service delivery, where people feel and see the services that is being delivered on the ground, while the control environment and the financial environment is also maintained and sustainable to make sure that there is accurate reporting, which will then also enable oversight and accountability, which we are here for today. So with that, Ilse, I would want to hand over to you, but I don't see the presentation on screen as yet. I'm not sure if you're struggling on your side to put up the presentation.
Has she been given co-hosting rights? Because that's what should happen. Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. I think we are sorted now and good to go.
Thank you. Thanks, Ilse.
Thank you very much, Pial, and I was just waiting for you to finish. So then, without further ado, thank you very much again, Honourable Chairperson and Honourable Members, for the privilege to then take you through this presentation. I just actually want to quickly just put the full screen on, if you can give me 2 seconds, so that I can just ensure that it is visible. So before we get started into the details of today's presentation, it's always good to just reflect as to why we are actually engaging in this meeting this morning. And in order for us to then combine, as in line with the accountability ecosystem, which I'm reflecting in the screen, which we all form a critical part of, to then advocate for an effective government culture. And if one looks at the different elements that comprises this culture that we all seek to achieve, Corné has mentioned some of it, but the institutional integrity, the performance, the accountability, and the transparency. And we are hoping that by presenting the audit outcomes of PRASA to you today in relation to the year 24-25, we will then play a role in ensuring effective oversight so that the effective government culture in line with this entity can then be further enhanced. If one looks at the overall outcomes over the past 5 years, I think it's probably superfluous to say that PRASA has come a really long way, moving from disclaimed audit opinions, which continued up until 21-22, to the unqualified opinion with findings in 24-25, as Corné has highlighted. What caused this improvement in the audit outcome? I think that is an important point to highlight, is that management actually accepted the matters that we brought forward in the year 21-22 still, and then devised a multi-year audit action plan that was really a systematic plan in terms of how to address those matters. And as Honourable Chair and Honourable Members can recall, these were quite numerous, especially in relation to PRASA's property, plant and equipment, or assets rather, and then worked systematically towards resolving these issues, which then resulted in the unqualified opinion in the current year. That, amongst others, in the previous year included a full reconstruction of the contract register. So the matters that were still qualified in the previous year related to commitments, operational and capital commitments that PRASA incurs as part of their daily business, as well as then disclosure in terms of delayed and halted infrastructure projects under construction, which we can all see really hinges on PRASA having an accurate, complete contract register, which is being monitored ongoingly. So important to note there is that during the audit process, there were still corrections of material misstatements, and these mainly related to these 2 matters that I've just highlighted, the commitments and this disclosure, where we did still find some factual errors, which management could then correct as part of the audit process, as well as then the cash flow statement, where there was just a misclassification between the operating and the investing activities relating to accruals that PRASA had at year end. So in essence, the key message that we have to take away here is, yes, there was an unqualified audit opinion, but there is still work to be done to make sure that the internal control environment matures in terms of the financial statements and financial management, to then ensure that this unqualified audit opinion on the financial statements remains sustainable. With regards to compliance of legislation, there I think we are still quite concerned in terms of the matters that are still not resolved, and as we've all noted, those are things that repeat year on year. So whilst we noted some progress in this regard, we still reporting in our audit report that effective and appropriate steps were not taken to prevent irregular and fruitless and wasteful expenditure, and then also that resources were not in all instances used economically and specifically in as far as the general overall program, which we will touch on in a later slide as well, is concerned. Then with the other aspect being a big concern is the consequence management, where we noted that whilst, as I've mentioned, there's been some progress, there is still a bulk of the irregular and fruitless and wasteful expenditure that have not been dealt with appropriately in terms of consequence management and the further steps that then has to follow that process. Important to note, when you look at the audit outcome for 24-25 is also the financial health of PRASA, where we did include in our audit report that there is a material uncertainty related to going concern. It's important to note that there will be continued government funding of PRASA, therefore the entity will continue to exist. However, what we might see coming across in the near future is that the entity might have significant trouble in meeting its ongoing obligations as and when they fall due. The main reasons then for raising this material uncertainty was the operating deficit, and important to note is that that is basically the deficit that was made when you do not take into account the funding by government, which is highlighted in this last bullet, where we noted that 88% of the total revenue is still coming from government funding, which include then the capital grants. There were material losses in terms of assets that were written off in the current year to the value of 1.3 billion, and then also a very material impairment rather of rolling stock, which was subjected to the general overhaul program but is not currently being effectively utilized and is in essence idling, of 2.6 billion rand. And then also important to note is the budget cuts during the year under review, which then resulted in a review of the rollout of the capital program. So in other words, when the capital grants got cut, PRASA also had to curtail some of the planned activities. Then in terms of the impact, obviously when we see adjustments coming through as part of the audit process, it really concerns us from a perspective of accurate in-year financial information. If we look at one of the areas, it includes the delayed and altered infrastructure projects. So what we are saying is if you do not have accurate and up-to-date information in terms of those areas, it might negatively impact critical decision-making processes, and obviously you will not be empowered to make course corrections and take corrective action if there are matters that needs to be unblocked. So that is why we are saying that whilst we really commend PRASA for the unqualified opinion, there is still work to be done to ensure that ongoing financial management and even performance processes can be monitored ongoingly. Then the failure to prevent irregular and fruitless and wasteful expenditure obviously then reduces the needs for the funding available for critically needed activities. So if fruitless and wasteful expenditure is incurred, we do see that it reduces the funds available for other areas. Then consequence management and the lack thereof may potentially lead to a culture of non-performance, wrongdoing, and lack of accountability, whereas I've highlighted the material uncertainty in terms of then having a negative impact on operational costs and PRASA's ability ultimately to fulfill its mandate. If we move along, the positive aspect of the prior year's audit outcome then really relates to the performance, where we saw a very positive increase over the past couple of years, with PRASA having achieved 93% of their performance targets for 24-25, and we did not report any material findings in terms of the performance achievements that were reported. The programs or the objectives rather that we selected for auditing was then objective 1, being delivering on excellent passenger service aligned to passenger needs, which will result in 186 million passengers by 26-27, as well as the modernization and investment in operational assets, which was program objective 3. The key indicator that was not achieved related to the long distance passengers transported, where only 97% of the target could be achieved. And then in terms of the highlights, PRASA did spend 21.1 billion rand compared to the 11.6 billion capital allocated for 24-25. The remainder was financed out of the cash reserve. So this does not equate to overspending or money that was not available, but rather previous capital allocations which were not yet utilized. Then 88% of the PRASA Metro Rail service lines were restored by year-end, which was 35 out of 40. And then also important to note is that this was enabled then by appropriate safety and security measures to mitigate that inherent risk of vandalism on the railway tracks. And what we've noted is that the safety as well as the security incidents remained below the acceptable threshold and was reported to the RSR accordingly. Then the impact of all of this was that the passenger numbers rose with 95%. So whilst there's an acknowledgement that there's a really long way to go, if one looks at the target that is PRASA and oversight is setting, it really equates to 186 million passengers by 26-27, which is on our doorstep. Actually, it's the financial year that will commence in April. So if one considers the 76.7 million passengers in 24-25, it does indicate that a lot of work will have to be done to then reach that set target by 26-27. So in terms of the impact of the non-achievement on the long distance train route, there are a lot of citizens in the country which are forced to then take alternative modes of transport, which in many instances are significantly more expensive. That is why we are advocating for PRASA to also address this long distance passengers transported target, which they would have to do in coordination with Transnet, which is the owner of many of the rail network that goes cross country, to then enable citizens to travel for work, education, medical care, and family reasons in an affordable manner. Moving on, in the next two slides, we are going to be dealing with irregular and fruitless and wasteful expenditure incurred. And as we can see on the screen, this reflects the annual irregular expenditure. And I just do want to note that for consistency purposes in these next few slides, or next two rather, you would note that the figures are presented in millions. So what you are seeing on the screen in front of you is the irregular expenditure for 23-24 would be 5.6 billion, and then moving downwards slightly in 24-25 to 5 billion. Fruitless and wasteful expenditure then also declined, but by a much larger margin from 110 million to 19 million. So if we look at the irregular expenditure, perhaps important to note, and this is where the consequence management aspect comes into play again, that only 18% of the irregular expenditure that you see here, this 5 billion, actually related to procurement that was conducted during the financial year 24-25. And the majority of the 5 billion still relate to old procurement transactions that happened before the financial year, but in line with multi-year contracts. Then if we look at the fruitless and wasteful expenditure, that basically mainly related in the prior year and the current year to instances where employees were on suspension for periods exceeding 6 months. So we will deal with the comparison in one of the later slides, but important to note that during the year under review, that amounted to basically 12 million out of the 19 million. Then interest and penalties in terms of late payment of creditors amounted to approximately 3 million, and then various other matters constituted the remaining balance. For example, the non-utilization of software licenses, which we will also deal with in more detail on a later slide relating to information technology. The reduction in fruitless and wasteful expenditure then mainly relate to PRASA having done a lot of work during the financial year to then reduce and resolve these cases of long suspensions. In the previous year, in 23-24, it constituted 58 million rand. In other words, the salaries that were paid to the suspended individuals, whereas it reduced to 12 million, as I noted. Then on the irregular expenditure, the cases that were detected and that really comprises the 5 billion rand that we still saw in 24-25 was then in relation to supply chain management, where either competitive bidding processes were not followed, and as I've noted, those mainly related to episodes that occurred previous to 24-25, and then non-compliance with supply chain management processes in the awarding of contracts. So that would be either non-compliance to laws or PRASA's own supply chain management policy, as that is a very important element, PRASA being a Schedule 3B public entity. Then very important to note, highlighted in red, is the irregular expenditure that was reflected as under assessment as at the conclusion of the previous audit. So this related to items of 2 multi-year signalling tenders of and this is the total tender value, 11.2 billion and 6.3 billion, where these matters were audited in 23-24 when it was awarded. But because of more risks that came around and was also reported through the media, the matter was again looked at in 24-25 in conjunction with contract management. And we did in the audit process then detect certain irregularities, which led us to then communicate to PRASA that these contracts are irregular from our perspective. PRASA then exercised their rights in terms of the PFMI compliance and reporting framework to escalate these matters to the National Treasury. And as at today's date, Treasury did get back, but there's still nothing pointing to the fact that these contracts are not irregular expenditure. And I'm sure this is something the entity can also elaborate on when they do their presentation to the committee. However, from our perspective, these contracts remain irregular as at this point, and would need to then be reported on accordingly when the financial statements for the following year is presented for audit purposes. Then in terms of the balances, so what you see on the screen then is the irregular and fruitless and wasteful expenditure balances as at year-end, including historical irregular and fruitless and wasteful expenditure that is now presented in the annual report and no longer in the annual financial statements. So before we get started to just discuss this in a little bit more detail, it is important to note that because of PRASA's historical irregular and fruitless and wasteful expenditure qualifications, we did include a paragraph in our audit report to indicate then that we are technically not able to determine whether or not these balances are fairly presented because of the fact that there was never that exercise to go back and revisit these matters from the perspective that it was previously qualified. And with that, I mean before the PFMA compliance and reporting framework was changed to then only allow entities to put the annual figure, which we've presented in the previous slide, into the financial statements. Nonetheless, it is important to note that there are still very material balances that needs to be dealt with from a consequence management perspective, for irregular expenditure being 33 billion and fruitless and wasteful, which is approximately 1 billion as well, 980 million that was reported by PRASA. So there were a number of investigations that was conducted during 24-25, which we have reflected here. But the important thing to note is because of the magnitude of these balances, there is still a long way to go to catch up and to ensure that all of these items and matters that were included over the various years, of which some of these matters date really far back, is dealt with appropriately in line with legislation. So as I've noted in my previous slide, PRASA in essence could have avoided reporting irregular expenditure amounting to 4.9 billion in 24-25 and 4.8 billion in 23-24 respectively, had those matters been dealt with as and when they arose. Then from an investigation point of view, there are certain investigations that were conducted by independent forensic companies, and we've listed them on our presentation. So Firstly, there was an investigation into certain payments made prior to 31 March 2023, which probed the processing of payments, security risks around the lack of encryption of files, incorrect payments to service providers, and potential fraud. Similarly, investigation into SCM that also covered the period 2021 to 2022-23, and fleet management during that same period. So these matters having been dealt with financial years before 24-25, and then the one that is quite relevant in the current context, as I've mentioned, the General Overhaul Program is a matter that is also widely known, is where PRASA is refurbishing all train coaches, then not being appropriately utilized, but also some other elements and allegations around the mismanagement of this GEO program, for which the internal or independent forensic report also became available during 24-25. From the point of view of consequence management, PRASA has identified the various officials that were noted in these reports, and the disciplinary processes for those people are underway. Then also in terms of the General Overhaul Program specifically, I think it is important to note that this is also currently under consideration from a technical point of view from the Auditor General's material irregularity processes. Then with regards to ongoing investigations by law enforcement, there are respective matters that are still being investigated by the Directorate for Priority Crime Investigation, or the Hawks, as they are better known, and then 2 SIU proclamations, which have not been fully concluded. When we look at the information technology environment, the members would also recall that this is a matter that we also dealt with previously with the committee. So there have been some progress noted, actually quite material progress that has been taking place in terms of PRASA's information technology environment. But there are still critical deficiencies which we then aim to highlight as part of our presentation, which really speaks to IT security, which is a very relevant matter in this day and age. We've seen a number of cybersecurity incidents across the board, and what we found at the end of our audit, and it's probably important to note that this is a very dynamic environment, so it would be important to get the latest status then from the entity, as the 25-26 audit is still in the planning phase. So we are not able to speak to what is happening right now, but this is then highlighting the matters that we found at the conclusion of our previous audit, was that there were still prevailing weaknesses in terms of the cybersecurity environment. There is a recommendation that we made to PRASA in terms of the appointment of a Chief Information Security Officer, which does not happen overnight, but is something that they need to attend to, given the importance then of cybersecurity, which was still quite heavily outsourced in certain instances, causing potential oversight gaps in terms of the process. There is also a continued reliance on outdated and unsupported systems, and this really speaks to PRASA's legacy revenue systems. We do understand that there is a process now ongoing to then replace these systems with newer technology, but the quicker that can be done, the better, as the systems that were still in place during 24-25 is really not supported, and it becomes increasingly difficult then to ensure that various elements of appropriate IT management then can be embedded into those old legacy systems. We still noted some critical gaps in terms of weak password control, shared accounts, and inadequate privileged access reviews when we looked at the IT environment in 24-25, as well as the risk management framework that was approved, but still some policies being outdated, and then the effectiveness review, in other words, to say, whilst the risk assessment was performed and certain steps were put there as mitigating controls, how effective is this process in mitigating risks related to the information technology environment? Staff shortages was still an issue during the period under review, and then also importantly that we noted some project management weaknesses. in line with then implementing these actions and various projects to improve the IT environment, it would be important to have very strict project management disciplines in place to ongoingly manage and monitor these projects to ensure that it stays on track and to avoid missed timelines. Then also linking to that is, as I've mentioned, when we dealt with the fruitless and wasteful expenditure, we did note a number of instances where PRASA procured software licenses, but were they not using these licenses, which are in essence then fruitless and wasteful expenditure that could have been avoided, linking back to the project management and ensuring that one does a proper needs analysis and do not procure items that would not be used somewhere along the line. In terms of the impact, as I've noted, PRASA was still exposed to heightened risk of unauthorized access and in worst cases, operational disruption, financial loss. These shortcomings in the IT environment, especially in as far as the revenue is concerned, which links also to the passenger numbers, does expose PRASA to inaccurate performance reporting. So whilst we are still able, or were still able rather, to get around the systems and audit it like that, and therefore did not have material findings in terms of the performance information, this will become increasingly difficult as the passenger numbers are picking up. Then the inefficient use of resources, I have highlighted throughout the presentation. Obviously, this costly licensing that are not utilized then takes resources away from areas where it is desperately needed. With regards to governance, institutional capability and capacity, we've noted that the PRASA board remained stable during the 24-25 financial year, with the 10 members, which includes the chairperson, having then been appointed in previous financial years. So some stability at the board level. But this is not a new matter. We have highlighted this before, is the key vacant positions being on executive management level. And at the end of the 24-25 financial year, this constituted the Chief Financial Officer, the Chief Procurement Officer, the Group Executive for Legal Risk and Compliance, the Group Security Officer, as well as the Chief Information Officer. So there were officials that were acting in these positions, and in some instances for quite a protracted period, which probably went some way to mitigating the risk of continuous disruption. However, it is very important then to actually, apologies for that, which then went a far way in avoiding ongoing disruption. However, it is critical from a stability point of view that these positions are then filled without further delay. The employees on suspension, I think we've dealt with, so I won't deal with that again. In terms of the root causes, we are really saying that the accounting authority in this instance have not exercised adequate oversight in terms of the filling of the key vacant positions because this matter has been brought to their attention year on year. And that therefore then points to a slow response in addressing this remaining cases of management positions not being filled, as well as those remaining one or two officials that remains on long suspension. Then material irregularities. I won't deal with this slide in a lot of detail. I guess the committee, being the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, have dealt with this in quite a lot of detail as you're being briefed by the Auditor General on an ongoing basis. So in essence, the MI then, as you know, deals with non-compliance with legislation, fraud, theft, or breaches of fiduciary duty that is likely to result or resulted in a material financial loss, misuse, or loss of a public resource, or substantial harm to either the institution or the public. And as we've put on the screen here, there is a process that are followed. This does not introduce new requirements onto any accounting office or authority, but rather is the baseline requirements that each entity and department must adhere to. And if that is then not done, we then evaluate any identified elements, as I've noted, non-compliance and so forth, against the criteria of whether or not it constitutes a material irregularity. And it is important to note that there's ample time for management to then respond to these matters, but should ultimately the process not then been rectified as per the recommendations, we do then end up referring some of these material irregularities, recommending actions in the audit report, which is then ultimately might lead to binding remedial action or ultimately the issuing of certificate of debts. And in terms of the expanded mandate, it is important to note that the whole purpose is to strengthen public sector institutions to better serve the people of South Africa. If you look at the results for 24-25, there were 2 active material irregularities at the beginning of the financial year that was audited, of which the one is the misuse of a resource. And in this instance, so that is basically the criteria for the blue train. And in this instance, perhaps misuse is the general term, but it would rather speak to underutilization in this instance. So it relates to PRASA's new blue trains that are being manufactured ongoingly. And what we note is that a very extensive capital outlay has gone into then manufacturing these new trains, but regrettably they are underutilized compared to if we look at when the material irregularity came about, is where we were doing the analysis was on the 2022-23 financial year, where we reported that the fleet of 146 new trains at that point in time. Obviously, it's a lot more now as these trains are manufactured ongoingly in line with the commitment to manufacture 600 new train sets. At that point, with a total cumulative cost of 19.4 billion, within significantly underutilized, and we've quoted some statistics which I won't read now, but it was evident at that point that the underutilization was occurring. And during 24-25, the matter was followed up. So whilst we were noted some improvement, the situation was not fully resolved by the end of 24-25. And in terms of the status, when PRASA responded to the material irregularity that was issued, for obvious reasons, a lot of the steps that are being taken by the entity then ties directly to PRASA's capital rebuilding program, and in particular, the installation of appropriate signalling, which would enable them to increase the frequency of these trains significantly, which will then in turn alleviate the issue around underutilization. And what we've noted then at the end of 24-25 is that our evaluation was that appropriate steps were being taken to address this matter, but we will again follow up in 25-26 audit that we are currently busy with to then again evaluate progress in terms of the steps that were committed. Then on the next matter that was still active at the beginning of the financial year, this related to the matter around suspected fraud around ghost employees. So this is a matter that has been coming for a few financial periods. And what we noted in 24-25, or in fact throughout the process, is that initially appropriate steps were being taken to rectify the internal control environment that then informs how PRASA deals with the whole issue around employee cost, ensuring that only valid employees get paid. But when we did a re-evaluation during the financial year under review, it was noted that, despite some progress having been made, there are still quite significant deficiencies in this process. And then, obviously, as I've noted, one then goes into the next steps, as I've just gone back to this previous slide. And we had to sit back and do an assessment in terms of what would be the previous steps. And at that point, it was noted that this matter is being investigated from a fraud perspective by the SIU under proclamation. Therefore, from our perspective, we have then decided to no longer pursue this as a material irregularity from a regularity audit point of view, but to rather then follow up on the progress and the outcome of the SIU investigation as part of our normal audit process. Then just to conclude in terms of the root causes, recommendations and overall message, so that is just recapping on everything we've discussed. In terms of key root causes, why there are still elements in the environment that needs to be improved, is the vacancies in senior management as well as the capacity constraints in terms of the numbers and skills and critical units. The changes that must still be embedded and effective in the internal control environment to facilitate ongoing accurate financial reporting and compliance with laws and regulation. The inadequate oversight regarding the compliance with laws and regulations, as we've noted throughout the process, there are still some material concerns around non-compliance despite the improvement in the financial statements. The lack of appropriate and timeless consequence management and the information systems having remained deficient. The key recommendations to speaking then to those root causes from a perspective of investigations that should be conducted into all instances of irregular, fruitless and wasteful expenditure within 30 days after the conclusion of determination tests, and that is in line with the timelines prescribed by the PFMA compliance and reporting framework. And once such has been concluded, that the consequence management must be swiftly dealt with in line with the recommendations of the investigations. We've spoken about the filling of vacancies at senior management and other critical units, and then the standardized project monitoring method, which must be implemented, which would then, as I've highlighted earlier, allow for the consistent reporting of the status of infrastructure under construction. And as we've been going through the presentation, I think it's become evident as to why this monitoring of construction projects that are underway is so important, because it hinges on so many different elements that will then further enhance and embed good performance, and also do things like resolve the underutilization of certain assets of the entity. And then important to note is, when one has such a big entity like PRASA, it is really important to automate as many internal controls as possible, because that will then ultimately reduce the possibility of human error or accidental omission, which we still saw coming through, as I've noted in the introductory part of the presentation when we were dealing with the audit outcomes. So those errors that were corrected as part of the audit process would likely or might not have occurred if proper automated controls were in place, linking then to the information system technology environment, where one needs to be vigilant and ensure that in as far as possible, internal controls are automated. On the overall message, and these are the matters that we've also brought to management's attention, is that a credible action plan should then be developed to action those remaining matters in relation to irregular, fruitless, wasteful expenditure and the enforcement of consequence management. And as we've seen now, over a period of a number of years, PRASA has managed to actually get out of a disclaimed audit outcome because of the fact that they managed to then put the systematic action plan in place with milestones that were tracked. And that is what ultimately was the game changer in terms of the financial statements. Noting, as we've been saying all along, that there's still work to do to embed those controls to avoid a regression and PRASA going back to a qualified opinion. But in the same way, this can also be done then on these remaining areas of irregular and fruitless and wasteful and consequence management. The progress on the infrastructure rebuilding program, I've touched on the importance of that. It will have a very multiplying effect, a positive effect throughout the organization and the various elements, including, most importantly, service delivery, if these infrastructure projects can be expedited and properly monitored and properly implemented. The appointment of officials in senior management, it is very important to ensure that stability and to ensure that effective decision-making can take place, and to make sure that that can also be sustained going forward. The turnaround plan in relation to IT, that needs to be closely monitored to ensure sound financial management is enabled to automated controls, as I've noted, and importantly, that cybersecurity can be guaranteed. And then measures that must then be taken to strengthen the financial management disciplines to improve the financial health within the available resources. And Chairperson, I think, Honourable Chairperson and members, thank you very much. This will then conclude the presentation and we will then be taking questions from here onwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation, much appreciated. I will give the members the opportunity to ask some questions. And please just be prepared to put up the presentation if necessary. I'm sure you still have sharing rights. So, honorable members, there it is. Can we take some questions? Honorable Nilme.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning to the Auditor General, and good morning to my colleagues. Thank you very much for the presentation, and it was heartwarming to see that there is an improvement in the audit outcomes and that it was submitted on time. The non-compliance, I think, is there. Well, I think there is going to be some improvement as we go along. The questions that I wanted to check is the alignment between Transport, who is the owner of the infrastructure, and PRASA. The refurbishing of the trains that are not being utilized, is that because the infrastructure network is not fully suitable to take the trains, or what seems to be the delay in the trains system? Because it's very interesting, because it's when you're in Transport and you rely on another entity for your infrastructure, how is that alignment working between PRASA and Transport? That was one of my questions. I wanted a little more information on which licenses was it that they purchased that they were not using in that line. And then the cybersecurity, sure. I think going forward, that is something I think in this country, everybody, I think in government, I think that should be a priority whereby government leads and looks at cybersecurity. Because what the AG mentioned here, I was very interested in it, was there challenges where there is cash with the cyber security from the cash received. That was one of the areas. And I think from that side for now, Chair, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Honorable Mente. Shall we take, sorry, Honorable Nilme, my apologies. Shall we take Honorable Isaac and then get answers, and then we'll take the next two members?
Okay, great. Hi, good morning, Chairperson. Good morning, everybody on the meeting. Thank you to AGSA for another damning report. But nevertheless, be as it may, yeah, impressive that at least this time around we received the report somewhat timelessly, if I might use the word timelessly. But to get down to a few issues that I'd like to highlight is that I'd like to just understand through the AGSA, specifically these material losses of 1.3 billion rand that were written off. That was what was mentioned in the meeting earlier just now. So I want to just comprehend and ask, if that issue can just be explained in simple language, the writing off of the 1.3 billion rand on material losses. Then what I want to mention here, and perhaps AGSA would express themselves. I don't know, my takeaway is that there just seems to be huge governance failures within PRASA. And of course, there is this huge controversial multi-billion rand signaling contract that's awarded. So, I tried to read most of the presentation through last night, and this one on the signaling contract, stands out for me. It's worth billions, and I am of the opinion that there seems to be huge influence from outside forces, in terms of these contracts. But the procurement failures, I am again just wanting to hear and understand the opportunities for criminal networks to infiltrate, these infrastructure projects. Now, if you look at slide 6 for the benefit of colleagues that are on the meeting, that slide 6, if you read that slide and try to make some sense of it, I get an impression, and I say that this is honestly just my impression, that there seems to be, somewhat great infiltration from outside forces. I'd like to also hear the AGSA's view on the GO contract, or what I would term as the GO contract. Now, AGSA, I mean, will you consider this as fruitless and wasteful expenditures? Because the issue for me, just as a layman looking out from the outside in, I mean, all these scrap coaches that are rotting in these rail yards all over the country, I mean, there's no prospect, in my opinion, of them ever being used. I mean, they're just being stripped for parts. We've discussed this, I think, in the past. And of course, millions are just being lost on these fruitless and wasteful expenditure on this. Let me just use the word scrap coaches. And then, I think we'll need to interrogate the minister when she obviously comes to the committee regarding the issues of extortion, the issues of the IT breaches, which my colleague Helen May has just alluded to, the vacancies, and of course the ghost employees, which was now very much highlighted, and of course the recommendation on the investigations on non-compliance, and huge consequence non-management. So I'm not going to go through everything else. But anyway, I just wanted to highlight those few questions and again, those few comments that I've had, and I'm most grateful for the opportunity. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Honorable Isaac and Honorable Nelmay. Can we hand over to the AG for answers to those questions?
Thank you, Chairperson. Thank you so much. Can I ask Ilse to respond to the majority of these questions? I think it's more in terms of the detail, the codependency, both on Honorable Neil May and Honorable Isaac's questions. Ilse, if there is anything you need assistance from Pulani. Pulani is from our Information Systems Auditors unit. So if there's anything else, Pulani can come in and assist on the IT questions. Pulani, just introduce yourself if you come in. Ilse, if I can hand back to you, please. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Corné, and thank you to the honourable members for the questions. So first thing, dealing with the infrastructure and the refurbishing of the trains and the alignment in terms of the infrastructure network. So I think it's just important to note that Transnet comes into play when it comes to the cross-country. So in other words, it impacts on the long-distance passenger transport and not necessarily in terms of metro rail, which is the infrastructure in and around the cities where we see most of the passenger utilization taking place at the moment. So in terms of the refurbishing of trains, and I think there were a number of questions around the general overall contract. So basically, in essence, that you would see in our audit report that we've highlighted that in terms of this contract, at this point in time, it was considered as an uneconomical use of resources, and the member has mentioned that there's no reasonable prospect of using these refurbished coaches going forward, where we see quite a big investment coming into that, or at least in the past terms. So PRASA currently is exploring various different options of ultimately utilizing these refurbished coaches. But what we noted as part of our audit process, as we've been tracking this contract since its inception, was that according to us, there was never a proper updated feasibility assessment performed in terms of actually going ahead with refurbishment of these coaches. It was a matter that came from pre-COVID, and based on the evidence that we could see as part of our audit process, there was never really the accounting authority stepping back and saying, when this contract was finally awarded, whether the need was still there to then continue and to what extent these old coaches will be utilized, especially in light of, as we've mentioned as part of our presentation, these new blue trains being manufactured and being the preferred mode of transport now in terms of the passenger rail, the trains being much more modern as well as safe when compared to their predecessors, which were refurbished. So from that perspective, then I think the entity will be better placed to say what is the current status, but as of the last check and when the audit was concluded the previous time, there were a number of options being explored in terms of future utilization of these trains. So at the point of concluding the previous audit, it was not yet termed as fruitless and wasteful, although this contract was audited at the time and it is classified as an irregular contract, which then also resulted in the investigation that we then mentioned as part of the independent forensic investigations that were concluded during 24-25, where the disciplinary action in terms of those contracts are underway. Then when we looked at the software licenses, so we are able to then furnish a detailed listing thereof, but in the main, these really related to your Microsoft more advanced. Let me just give one example. The customer services digital adding messaging add-on, the Visio plan. There were customer services enterprise. So it's not a specific software license, but rather software licenses that were procured in bulk. And then when we tested the utilization thereof, we realized that the number of licenses that were needed did not correspond to how many were procured, and that then resulted in the fruitless and wasteful expenditure that we've noted. But our colleague will also further expand on that if there is a need. Then if we look at the 1.3 billion assets that were written off, so we've been noting that they were year on year, there have been assets that were impaired at PRASA. And then obviously when one impair an asset, it's indicating that the asset is no longer in the condition that it's supposed to be, and that it can't basically bring in future economic benefits. But at some point, that then moves from an impairment to a write-off of the asset. And as part of the infrastructure reconstruction, what one would see is obviously some of these assets as they are being replaced will then need to be fully written off. So that will then result in a tangible write-off of the asset where you technically remove it out of your asset register. And then in terms of the signaling contract, and the comments have been noted, I think we have noted from our side that there were findings raised during 24-25 that indicates that this according to us, should be an irregular contract, and that the matter was escalated to Treasury. In terms of the forensic elements thereof and the matters that were mentioned, there was a forensic investigation performed that we do not have privy yet of the outcome of that. So obviously from a regularity audit perspective, it is not a forensic investigation, and to that extent, we can't comment on those elements that are being alleged. However, from our perspective, there are some irregularities in terms of the procurement process and baseline compliance with laws and regulations, which we did touch on during the presentation. And then I just wanted to see if there was anything else. Honourable Chair, I think I will hand back to my colleagues if there's something that, apologies, I think just in terms of the cybersecurity, I just note here that there was also a question in terms of whether there are cash elements involved. So PRASA does deal with cash, especially in terms of the passengers that then still at present is mostly paying cash for their tickets. So that then speaks to the legacy revenue systems as well. So whilst there was no tangible security, cybersecurity incidents during 24-25, there was previous incidents of which can be attributed to cybersecurity failure, which then is in the process of being addressed by PRASA. So whilst we've noted that they've devised an action plan in terms of how to deal with the shortcomings, so to speak, in the cybersecurity environment, what we noted was that all of it was not yet in place and sufficiently addressed when we concluded our previous audit. So that remained in progress, and I'm sure the entity will be able to give the current status in terms thereof. Thank you, Chair. I think now I am really done, and I will then hand back to my colleagues.
Thank you so much, Ilse. I think you've covered the questions. I don't have anything to add from my side. Chairperson, unless there's follow-up questions on these questions, I think I'll then hand back to you. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Honourable Nilme, is there a question that wasn't answered? I see your hand is back up.
No, thank you, Chair. Chair, it was just a follow-up, and the follow-up question wasn't so much of what I asked, it was what my Honourable Isaac asked. It was the signalling contract. There were two companies, and in my mind, I was actually thinking, gee, do we actually have the capacity to actually do such a very intricate signalling contract? And then what I forgot on my next page was the question that I was going to ask is, because the allegations indicated that over 2.6 billion was paid in early 2023-24 as upfront fees for site establishment to contractors who failed to meet contract conditions. Now, these two contracts, is the one contract cancelled? Because this contract, when I did some research, it was about 18 billion. There were the two. There was Maziza General Services and its partners, including Chinese Railway International Group. And so this is what I was trying to work out, is that whole contract, that is a lot of money. What is the status of the contract? And has the AG picked up in the sense of, has any money been retrieved from I suppose that we'd have to ask the SIU. The other aspect was the board. The chairperson, do we have the same chairperson, Chair, that when we visited PRASA, is that the same chairperson that has been re-elected? And the new board members, are they new board members, or are we still with the current board members? Thank you. Sorry for it was on page 2 of my book. Sorry.
All right, thanks, Honourable Nilme. Shall we take Honourable Mende?
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. Good morning to everyone on the call. No, Chair, just a few clarities. Firstly, on the ghost workers, when AG says they are no longer pursuing the matter themselves, simply because the SIU is taken over through the proclamation, which was signed in 2024. Now we are in 2026, there's still no outcome. I want to understand, are they satisfied with what is happening? And the second question to that is that, what actions were they actively taking as AG in pursuing the matter? What is it exactly that they were doing in monitoring the matter? And did that particular action, which they were employing in monitoring, get carried over to SIU, or SIU did better in terms of the monitoring? I'm raising this here because from the AG side, this is a material finding, and it should always be on the findings, on the outcomes of the AG. But if then SIU is doing it, then I don't know how they are getting information and how they are exchanging information in terms of updating the findings of the AG as well as the ongoing process of the SIU. But secondly, since it's now 2 years later, what is the SIU saying to you, since you have given over this matter to them? What are they saying to you? What is the stumbling block, and why is this not completed 2 years later? That's pertaining to ghost workers. Then number two is the issue of the 146 trains at the cost of 19.3 billion that are there versus the 600. I think it was 600, which initially was planned to have been built and all of that. Then they are saying in terms of performance, there are trains that are underutilized. I want them to take us through like baby steps in that. Firstly, there's 19.3 billion cost of the train, 146 trains. When they look at the cost per train, is that a reasonable cost? And secondly, if then they are underutilized, what was the explanation of the CEO and the CFO in this regard? Are they satisfied with what they told them? Because they're going to come here and tell us a different story, like everyone else who says, no, we have explained this to AG. They are not necessarily standing, they are working, but these are the challenges and all of that. Please take us on board and explain it much further as to what is this, because when you say 19.3 billion, and then you put in that same sentence that there's an underutilization of a couple of billion, that is billion standing that could have been invested elsewhere by Department of Transport, even in the taxi industry or wherever. However, it's been invested in them, but they are not utilizing it. What's happening here, and what is the explanation to you from the management? Then the last part, AG, and I'm gonna fight with you on this one. Material findings on the compliance with legislation is all red. And you are indicating very serious non-compliances surrounding this material finding. The financial statements that were submitted, they are not fully prepared in accordance with the generally recognized accounting practice. And there were no appropriate steps taken to prevent irregular and fruitless wasteful expenditure. So around there, give us examples as, or rather, whatever transactions that you have tested. You have tested a, a procurement of a coach and you found an irregularity. What was that irregularity versus what is expected to have happened? Because around this particular area, this is where most of the corruption is taking place in this country. Fruitless and wasteful expenditure is not necessarily where we should focus the most. It's around this irregular. And it gets explained. And what pains me, AG, is that it gets explained like it's nothing. People don't follow the law. They buy things without following the law. And then they come to explain to us as if it was an emergency. Then they design emergencies. Then they design bids and they do wrong things. They constitute BACs wrongly. They score wrongly. They even design scopes for each other and all of those things. So you ought to take us neatly, especially at PRASA, because this is where they use irregularities and not follow law so that they can accommodate the maladministration. And we find it a lot there. So it will be appreciated that when you give us this, then you give us a narrative, or even in your document, of all the transactions or rather projects or anything that you have tested and you found the irregularity, and highlight it clear as to what is the irregularity and what is the status at this moment, and where the investigations and disciplinary steps were not conducted. This is another worrying factor where now there's a new tendency, not even SIU recommendations are actioned. So if you have found investigations and disciplinary steps that were not taken on which highlighted areas which you have highlighted the previous day and they're still not being taken care of, and nothing was done in order to correct that particular finding you have given to the entity, and as well as if you do know the names or rather departments and the transactions thereof that you were indicating, it will help us the most. Then on performance, I see the performance is doing well in terms of the audit, but I don't know how you juxtapose the performance with the underutilization of the trains, because there are areas where there are no trains, but I also see that they are intended performance was short of 5 and all of that. So I want you to juxtapose the performance that is great versus the underutilization of the trains that are there, and what was the shortfall caused by the trains that are sitting there in terms of the targets and the KPAs that the entity itself expects for itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Member. I think let's take these 2 rounds of questions. Otherwise, I think the list might get long. So sorry, Honorable Skosana, will have to wait a little bit longer. My apologies. Can we hand over to the AG team?
Thank you, Honourable Chairperson, and thank you for the follow-up questions and then also the questions from Honourable Menti. I'm going to ask Siswe to respond to the question around the MI, the ghost workers, and the actions and what we have been doing and the follow-up work. And then I'll ask Ilse to reflect on the more detail around the trains, the underutilization, the cost thereof, the compliance questions that has been asked, and then also to reflect on the performance. The doing good in terms of what was reported by PRASA compared to the underutilization. And then we'll also respond in terms of the follow-up question on the signalling contract. I think from my side on the signalling contract, there was mention, and I do think maybe PRASA is in a better position to respond, considering the capacity and also the current state where this contract is and what has happened in terms of potential cancellations. as Ilse did indicate, we've concluded the audit in terms of 24-25 a while back, and there might have been some new developments. There's also the investigation report that she has mentioned previously, which we don't have access to at the moment. So in that regard, I do think maybe PRASA is in a better position to give a bit more information around that. The board members and the board, I think there was one slide that was presented which indicated that there was stability in terms of board members, and I don't have the presentation in front of me at the moment, but I do think, if I remember correctly, it indicated that there was 10 members that has been there for more than 1 year, including the chairperson, which then brought some stability in terms of the accounting authority of PRASA. Sizwe, maybe I can hand over to you to respond on the MI questions from Honourable Menti, and then Ilse, if you can assist us with the detail on the other questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Corne. Thanks, Chairperson and Honourable Mente. So on the material irregularity, when we did identify it in the previous financial periods, we assessed it and concluded that it's a material irregularity, and it was correctly reported in the audit report to the client as a material irregularity. And then we started checking, especially when it comes to the internal control environment, because we had found that it's what had enabled this issue of ghost employees. And then we noted that the internal controls were still not yet enhanced to address the issue. However, because SIU was doing a concurrent investigation, a deeper investigation into the matter, so our material irregularity process in the office does allow that to avoid its duplication of efforts or identifying the appropriate bodies that can further continue and pursue the matter. When we had concluded that the controls were still not enhanced to the point of satisfaction, and then identified that the SIU was engaging in a deeper investigation, then we decided, as part of collaboration, we decided on not pursuing it now as a material irregularity, even though it would have been reported in the audit report and management report in the previous year. And then SIU then had to SIU then had to continue with their investigation. And then from the regularity point of view, then on a regular basis, we do get status or follow up on status on this matter, since it's a matter that would have been raised even from our side in the previous years. The last time we obtained the status of the matter it was still in progress. There is no outcome as yet. I think SIU would have the latest status as to have they concluded now as of today the investigation, or whether they're at advanced stages. But as part of this process, although we had raised it and elevated to management and then the audit report, then we decided not to pursue it further, and then SIU then to continue with a deeper investigation to really get to the crux of what led to the entire ghost employees in the client. Thanks, Corne. Over to you, Ilse.
Thank you very much, Sizwe. And just to then respond to the remaining questions. So there was a question in terms of the performance, in terms of the shortfall of the trains, and then the juxtaposition in terms thereof. So when the performance targets gets compiled, those obviously needs to be ambitious yet achievable in terms of the current state of the rail network infrastructure. And as we've mentioned when we were speaking about the underutilization of the trains, which then links to the question around the cost of the trains and the massive capital outlay that has gone into it. So from that perspective, this contract was entered into in 2013 already for the manufacturing of the 600 new blue trains. And the costs at that point were contractually determined. And so in terms of the cost, that then refers to the cumulative cost of the trains as at that point in time. So the important thing to note is that in terms of the manufacturing of these trains, the challenge with the rail network infrastructure is that once all the elements come together, in particular the signaling infrastructure, in terms of the rail network infrastructure, it really then enables the utilization of the trains to not even linearly improve, but rather that you can go from one train an hour to literally one train every 10 minutes, as an example. So with that in mind, it's not like the manufacturing of the trains can be halted at this point in time, because when it does arrive at that point, it then enables the effective utilization thereof. And that is also from that perspective that this material irregularity is really being followed up by looking at whether or not the infrastructure recovery is on track to then enable the full utilization of these new trains. So the performance then was aligned to what was achievable yet ambitious at the point in time that the performance compact was drafted. And like we've highlighted when we were discussing the performance, you can see that there is an incremental increase in passenger numbers that's expected in the next 2 years. And that will then also speak to increased frequency of the trains running and enhanced utilization of those trains. Then just to attend to the questions in terms of the irregular expenditure and the reasons in terms thereof, and I think by no means are we trying to understate the impact and the possible consequences of irregular expenditure. It is just that it is comprised by quite a number of different items. So if one can perhaps give one example, so there would be legal cases. PRASA actually constituted a proper legal panel, and I'm speaking under correction, but it must have been about 2 years back. But at that point in time, there were still ongoing legal cases where there were already legal counsel engaged on previous appointments which didn't follow processes, and because of complications and then continuity purposes, obviously if there's high profile cases, then they would continue then to utilize the same legal expertise on those specific cases, which would then perpetuate the irregular expenditure. But I think from that perspective, it might be best placed to ask PRASA to then furnish the details of what comprises that big balance. But as we've highlighted, it is various different elements of either not entering into a procurement process, as I've mentioned now in the case of the legal expertise, or then alternatively some legislated or policy non-compliance in terms of when the procurement process takes place, and that is various different elements at different times that might not have been complied with. Then in terms of the disciplinary steps, from the audit point of view, and what we've noted is that once investigations have been concluded, there is definitely that attendance to the recommendations and taking disciplinary steps. And the entity will highlight that there's been a lot of movement in terms of disciplinary action. However, the crux of the matter is that all the irregular and fruitless and wasteful expenditure instances is not being investigated. So in other words, it requires that initial step of investigating the matter in order to then enable the recommendations and to determine whether somebody is liable and then taking relevant further actions. So from that perspective, the crux of the matter, as highlighted in the audit report, is the fact that there's still a huge backlog in terms of fruitless and wasteful and irregular expenditure that needs to be investigated. Thank you, Honourable Chairperson. Back over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Honourable Mende, your hand is still up. I just want to make sure is it a new or old hand?
Now it's still the old hand, Chair, but I just have a request to AG.
Yes.
Please provide us with the narrative report. It will help us a lot, because once you highlight irregular and you highlight the cost thereof, it raises too much of it. And once we meet with the entity and we don't get to delve deeper into these itemized transactions, which says it comprises of a lot of things, or a lot of things doesn't help us when we meet those people, because we're going to request them that around irregular, whatever you have declared in your financial statements, please provide to the committee. And then after providing to the committee, they're going to provide a lot of explanation around it, and make a lot of assertions that they've convinced you, you are convinced, and all of this and all of that. So it really doesn't help us to get the information from you as to this is an irregular and this is the problem and all of those things. So it will help us to get that narrative, especially if you can highlight some of the transactions or different projects that you have tested and you are still convinced that it's irregular expenditure and no steps were taken and it's still not being taken. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Honorable Mende. Honorable Skosana.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Honorable Chair, and good day to all honorable members, our support team, and the AGSA team. No, we appreciate the report about the audit outcomes of PRASA. We're noting that they've improved from a qualified audit opinion to an unqualified with findings audit opinion for the year under review. I think those are good news, Honorable Chair. Secondly, we're also noting that there's a reduction on the fruitless and wasteful expenditure, and also a slight reduction on the irregular expenditure for the year under review. We're also noting that. However, coming to the issue of consequence management, I think the AGSA is reporting that they are moving very slowly in that regard. So I just want to find out as to what is the reason, what are they presenting as the reason for their slow movement in terms of dealing with the consequence management processes. My second question is with regard to cases that are under Hawks investigations since 2016. Is PRASA receiving updates from Hawks regarding those cases which are under Hawks investigation since 2016? Have they reported to you that they are getting updates about those cases? Because I mean, if it's 2016 and now we are in 2026, meaning that there are cases that are 10 years old which are under Hawks investigation. Then coming to the issue of internal control environment, I think we are reporting that the internal control environment, which is meant to facilitate ongoing, accurate financial reporting and compliance with laws and legislations, are not functioning as intended in certain instances. So I want to check as to what is the reason for that. Is it a challenge of shortage of staff with requisite skills and experience in this regard, or what? And then my next question is with regard to inadequate oversight regarding compliance with laws and regulations and slow response in addressing previously reported material non-compliance. I'm checking this versus what has been reported, that there is a stability board Why there's a lack of oversight in this particular regard while the board is stable, or it is stable? Does that mean the board is stable but not really performing their duties to the fullest, or what? And then my last part one question is with regards to vacancies at senior management level. Why is this the case? Is it the challenge? Are they having a challenge of resources that makes them unable to fill all those critical vacancies at senior management level? Is it a challenge of resources in terms of the remuneration and all that, or what? And then lastly, the issue is with regards to the issue of ghost employees and SIU investigation. I want to check whether as AGSA, are you not able to make a determination as to whether at the current moment are there ghost employees or not, whilst the SIU is investigating this historic matter of ghost employees? Because we are all aware that this is not a new matter, it's a historic issue. And I think that's what the SIU is investigating. But I want to find out as to currently, are you not able as AGSA to make a determination as to whether, as things stands, are there ghost employees or not, whilst the SIU is investigating the historic part as to whether there were at any point ghost employees at PRASA? Those are my questions, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Skosana. Let's just take the follow-up from Honorable Isaac. I see your hand went up.
Yes, Chair, definitely is me. I just had a quick one. I just wanted to check through you, Chair, to PRASA. I mean to the AG rather. Does PRASA use external auditors to assist with their audit process? That's it. Simple question. Thank you.
Sorry, you're saying does PRASA use external
auditors to assist with the audit process?
Okay, so you mean do external auditors support the internal audit team? Or are you
Yes.
saying?
Yeah, exactly. I just wanted to understand, if PRASA makes use of consultants
I
rather
see.
for the audit process. Yeah.
All right. Okay, no, I get you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much. Over to you, AG team.
Thank you, Honourable Chair, and thank you, Honourable Skosana and Honourable Isaac, for those questions. I'm going to ask Siswe to respond in terms of the question around the internal control environment, and then specifically the root causes of what is causing the current findings that we still have. And then I'll ask Ilse to respond to the other questions around what's the reason for the slow movement that was there, the Hawks investigations, again, the board question and the vacancies, as well as to the question around consultants. I think, Honourable Skosana, you also had a question around the ghost employees and what work the AGSA basically do, and can we do something? So I can confirm that annually from our audit procedures, we also do test and work to confirm ghost employees. We also do it through CATs, computer-assisted techniques, where we also do some work to verify. And currently, we haven't identified, in the past audit, we haven't identified any ghost employees through the work that we have been doing through our normal regularity audit process. So I thought, let me just confirm that we are doing work and that we haven't found anything for the past year. Ilse, maybe I can hand over to you, and then thereafter I can ask Sizwe to close on the internal control question. Thank you.
So perhaps in terms of the slow response on the consequence management, so the whole issue around investigations, which perhaps links to the question in terms of internal audit, is being coordinated by PRASA's internal audit unit, which do have internal staff members. However, they do use what we call a co-sourcing model. In other words, some of the work in terms of their annual plan will then be outsourced or co-sourced to other firms that works then under the direction of PRASA's internal audit capacity. So when one looks at the magnitude of the irregular and the fruitless and wasteful balance that still remains outstanding, it is arguably a capacity issue in terms of being able to then address some of these matters with speed. So that is definitely a hampering factor in terms of comparing the magnitude of the outstanding balance to be dealt with compared to the internal staff complement that is able to deal with that. Then also perhaps for noting, as we've been auditing, what does pose a challenge is that not necessarily in the past number of financial years, but historically, and in particular coming from the years where there were the disclaimed audit outcomes, the limitation of scope in terms of supporting documents that are not available to conduct the requisite determination tests and then subsequent investigations are posing quite a large challenge in terms of getting the consequence management done. But nonetheless, I think from our perspective, as we've highlighted in the presentation, what would be needed is a proper action plan with committed deadlines in terms of how to deal with that outstanding balance. And then in instances, for example, like limitation of scope, then taking the matter further to see how it can be dealt with, be it through engagements with the Treasury or perhaps even escalating matters for further investigation to law enforcement. But there needs to be a tangible action plan that will be put in place with milestones and deadlines to track then the process and to finally get this matter out of the way. Then in terms of the Hawks investigations, the entity would probably be better placed to then respond on that question. Whilst there are regular engagements with the DPCI and PRASA, at this point in time, I don't think I am in a position to then respond to whether or not there's been recent engagements in terms of this outstanding investigation. Then in terms of the vacancies, the board has been stable, as we've highlighted in the presentation. So there hasn't been instability at the board level. However, the vacancies in senior management, it is important to note that some progress has been made. I mean, if one looks at, for example, the chief executive officers of the tech division, the rail division, which was appointed, and some head of internal audit that was also up to recently vacant that was filled. So it's those remaining positions that's on the presentation that remains vacant, where the recruitment process is underway and at various stages, which I'm sure the entity will be able to give the current status when they then respond to the questions. But ultimately, as we've noted, in terms of shortage of capacity, finance unit and so forth, that Sizwe will deal with when we speak about the internal control environment, is we've noted an improvement, but it is still not at the level where it's supposed to be, obviously combined with a very large entity and our emphasis in terms of rather converting some of the things that are happening manually at the moment to automated controls to try and eliminate the risk of human error. Thank you, Sizwe. Over to you.
No, thanks, Chairperson. Yeah, maybe on the internal control, Chair, just to elevate about 2 or 3 key ones. I think the main driver to what we're seeing is it starts with vacancies or capacity issues. That we've noted that there's vacancies in the space which now lead to the internal control, because that's the basic basis or governance foundation, where you have dealt with vacancies, then you have enough people on the ground on permanent basis who are able to assist in the improvement of control. So the vacancies is the key one, repeating from what Ilza was saying that we've identified. And also because we're dealing with a huge institution with a lot of processes, Chairperson. So that dependency on some manual processes, because the IT environment is not assisting the institution to automate some of the processes, then it leads to errors in the system. So if I can elevate, in addition to what Ilza was saying, those two key areas, Chairperson, if they are attended to, they will definitely improve the overall internal control environment in the entity. So it's just to elevate those. Thanks, Chairperson.
Thank you very much. Let me just ask the honorable members if there are any follow-up questions. I have a couple of clarification questions on my side, but I just want to be sure the members have asked all they could. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Colleagues from AG, may I just ask that you assist me in a couple of areas, and I will go through slide by slide. If we can go to the slide with overall audit outcomes. What slide is that? It's slide 4. If we can go there together, and on the top right hand, the financial health of the organization. So can you just set out for me at least a couple? In fact, let me start with bullet number 1, 2, 3, 4, the rolling stock issue. So did PRASA give any definitive answer now in terms of what happens to that rolling stock and that program? Are they completing it and then the trains will stand? Are they canceling it? What has been your conversation with him? There was the material impairment of rolling stock to the value of 2.6 billion. Sorry, could you hear me?
Apologies, Honourable Chair. Would you like us to address the questions as we're going along?
Yes, please. I'll ask one at a time.
100%. So perhaps in terms of the rolling stock question, so yes, the contracts, remember this contract, we speak about it as the general overall program, but there were a number of contractors that were appointed to perform this overall of the old rolling stock. So some of those contracts have been cancelled, and that also speaks to the investigation that was performed, the independent forensic investigation that was performed into the program. So it is our understanding that some of the contracts were cancelled. Some others are still ongoing. And in terms of our discussions with the entity, in terms of the way forward, there were a number of options that were being explored, amongst others, the creation of a rolling stock company where these coaches will then be furnished to other external parties, which will pay PRASA in return. There were also some mention of perhaps then considering and exploring the option of utilizing this refurbished rolling stock in terms of the long distance routes, which is obviously not suitable for the new electric blue trains, considering the fact that there's also elements of the Transnet network in there. So, Chairperson, that was the preliminary discussions and the responses that we have received. And we do believe that some expression of interest documents have been put out into the market in terms of that rolling stock company.
Okay, so it then would be, okay, it would be fair for us then, and I'd like the Secretariat to note this, that we must be specific in our invitation to PRASA, that we need we need a submission on that program because it has to get somewhere. It's been beset by problems. Just in terms of the contracting itself and the disputes between contractors about allocation of work, between PRASA and contractors about allocation of work, etc. And then there's the money that's being spent. I don't think they're quite clear about what happens to the trains thereafter. So that is the first thing. The second is, can you, maybe I may have missed it, the bullet point above that, the material losses of 1.3 billion due to write-off of property, plant and equipment. What happened there? Sorry, can you hear me?
Apologies, Honourable Chairperson. I was just struggling with the mute button. Chair, just to confirm, are we speaking about the write-off of the assets?
Correct.
Okay. So as we've noted that since PRASA started to clean up their assets, when was that? About 3 years, 4 years ago, where there was that full asset count. There was a major impairment and some subsequent impairments that PRASA posted through its financial statements. So obviously, when an asset is impaired, there is those indicators that the asset might not be functioning as intended and so forth. But ultimately, the asset then needs to be de-recognized or written off. So this is not necessarily a new thing that came around, but rather it being taken out of the impaired assets and then being fully written off as the network is being rebuilt. If one can use an example, there's an element on the rail infrastructure network that's damaged, so it gets impaired in the process, and then when it gets reconstructed or then fixed, there might be a need to then de-recognize the old asset so that the new asset can take its place. So that is then in essence speaking of writing off or then finally de-recognizing that as an asset out of your asset register. Chair, I hope that explains the process.
Right. Okay. I get that. And then the operating deficit increased from 2.3 billion to 8.3. No, I think I got that. So, in fact, the top two are kind of related for me. So, the last time that PRASA came to the committee, if I recall, or the second last time they did, the time before last, they complained about ticket revenue and that they were on 2015 pricing. So that's the one thing. The second thing is I also note that they continue to have problems getting the new rolling stock back onto the rails at the speed at which they need to in order to get the passenger volumes. I don't know if there's a way in which you can kind of narrate this because there seems to be a relationship between that constraint of not being able to get trains on the road, one. Two, that they are not able to adjust ticket prices. I understand the last attempt to do a ticket price adjustment failed. And thirdly, the reliance on government subsidies. Have you been able to take a view of when that, I don't want to call it a tipping point, but it feels to me that there will come a point when there is a bit of a crunch in terms of their ability to generate cash versus their operating obligations. Have you had that conversation with them around when either the operating revenue is going to increase, alternately, then there's going to be a problem? I don't know if my question makes sense.
Thank you very much, Honourable Chairperson, and yes, we do take note of that. So it is my understanding that there was a ticket price increase, at least in certain aspects, but that would come through in this new financial year. But PRASA can just confirm that, as obviously during the 24-25 financial year that we audited, the ticket pricing was still the same, but I did note that there were some ticket pricing increases in the year that is ending now at the end of March. And then in terms of the network, I think, and the ability to bring the trains back on, I think we've had quite extensive deliberations on that throughout the presentation, in the sense that the challenge probably is sitting that some of this reconstruction of the rail network, and in particular the signalling, is not an overnight business. It is a multi-year scenario where the trains can actually be utilized quite a lot quicker once all of those infrastructure is in place, which is ongoing. I think it would be bold of me to say that yes, there has been discussions, and I think in terms of the government funding, obviously if things go according to plan, at some point one will see quite a material reduction in terms of that, especially in as far as the capital grants are concerned, once the network gets back to full capacity. However, I think I would not want to speculate in terms of exactly when that tipping point will occur. One would hope it will be in the next couple of years. But perhaps just to also reflect on then the increase in the operational deficit also relates to some of the spending on the capital. That money, obviously, which was advanced in previous financial years, was banked and was earning interest, which has significantly declined in the past 2-3 years, as PRASA is spending the money then, as we've highlighted, in addition to what they've actually received to then rebuild the network.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I see Honourable Beasley's hand is up. Honourable Beasley.
And thank you, Chair, and apologies for coming in late. I just had to vote on the fiscal framework quickly. But just a couple of questions, and I do apologize if they have been covered, but I think for me, two issues that stand out quite alarmingly is just the lack of consequence management. We're never going to turn any state-owned and any public if there's no consequence management. And I've expressed a view before, is that sometimes I think consequence management doesn't happen because those who are meant to be doing it have got their own skeletons. And I'm just wondering if the AG can express a view as to why, consequence management is not happening, and if they can issue a material irregularity against the accounting officer for the lack of consequence management, because until, it happens, nothing is going to change. We can give PRASA more money, we can do what we like, but until there is proper consequence management, and I think as SCOPA, it's important for us to ensure that consequence, and maybe if the Auditor General can just express opinion why it's not happening and any concerns around that. And then the second thing, it's quite clear with the acting senior positions. I mean, it's a huge concern when the IT person's not acting, when the financial director officers acting. Why are these positions acting for so long in such senior positions? And maybe the Auditor General can express an opinion on that. And then an area of concern is just these suspensions. Can the Auditor General give an idea how long some of the people have actually been suspended for, if they've got that information on hand? I can appreciate the cost of the suspensions dropped every year, but even 12 million for the past financial year is huge. But if we have an idea for how long some people have been suspended for and the reasons why they've been suspended for so long. And then another area of concern is just the annual financial statements having to be corrected. I mean, in essence, what the AG was saying, if those financial statements weren't corrected because of their input, they would have been qualified again. And, an organization as large as PRASA, the AG shouldn't be having to point those corrections out. It should be coming to them fully corrected. And then, Chair, I sort of got the end of your last question, and it relates to the going concern. obviously PRASA is kept going by the subsidies. Without the subsidies, they wouldn't be able to keep in existence. But how much is PRASA's expenses appreciating every year? What percentage-wise? Because in order for PRASA to stay a governing concern, the subsidies would have to increase as much as that. So if they're increasing more than inflation, it's obviously a massive concern. So maybe the AG can just give, if they can, just give a, an update or just an idea of what the expenses are accelerating every year, and if it is above inflation, and if that does, add to the going concern problems. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Honorable Beasley. Can we get answers to those, AG?
Thank you, Honourable Chair and Honourable Beasley. Thank you for those questions. I think I've been reflecting on the question around the consequence management, and it's for sure a concern, and we've also raised it therefore as a non-compliance, not seeing appropriate action and traction on the implementation of the requirements, whereby it said that if there's irregular expenditure, there should be a process of identifying who is responsible, identifying the root causes, and then also to have the consequence management so that there is corrective actions and the environment can be strengthened to prevent going forward. I think from our observation, and Ilse, you can add once I'm done. I think there's two things that we've been highlighting, and that is the vacancies, the staff or the senior positions that is not necessarily filled, which could potentially impact this process to be concluded and to run. Maybe a lack of accountable people in the right positions to run with these processes. But then also what we've noted is the extent and the volume of irregular expenditure coming from prior years. So I think there is a number of contracts and processes that require investigation for them to move through this and to deal with it as required by the PFMA. And it will be critical for them to have a proper plan in terms of all of this irregular expenditure to say, what is the process? How are we going to deal with this? What is the timelines of dealing with these? Because otherwise it's going to become unsurmountable to try and deal with this if there is not a proper focus on how to deal with this irregular expenditure and the requirement of consequence management. I thought, let me just share my thoughts around what we've observed on the slow progress on consequence management. Ilse, maybe I can then hand back to you in terms of some of the other questions. Once again, the internal control environment, the corrections of Fs, which is equally important. I mean, it is critical in terms of the ideal culture that we said is to have that internal control environment to prevent these material findings, because if it's not prevented internally, it can easily result in a regression that the entity might face if their internal control environment didn't pick it up and they couldn't correct it before financial statements, for instance, is submitted to ourselves. But Ilse, let me hand over to you just for additional insights in terms of the questions by Honourable Beasley. Thanks.
Thank you, Corné, and thank you very much for the questions, Honourable Beasley. So I think perhaps just to highlight in terms of the internal control environment and the adjustment to the financial statements. So the material adjustments that we noted coming through had mainly to do with elements of still reconstructing that contract register and having an accurate record on an ongoing basis in terms of both all the committed contracts, both from an operating and capital perspective, and then the ability to continuously monitor the progress and the current status, especially in relation to capital contract, which then also informs the delayed and halted infrastructure projects disclosure that's required in the financial statements, obviously then also having an impact on the operational capabilities and the ability to successfully track those projects as and when they're getting implemented. Throughout the conversation, there's been a lot of highlighting of the importance of how important it is to implement these rebuilding contracts on time. And perhaps if I can also just reflect on the question in terms of operating expenditure and how that compares to the prior year. So there are a number of elements in PRASA's operational expenditure. Let's take, for example, municipal rates and taxes, energy costs and so forth, which are not necessarily controllable elements. So to that extent, it's probably the appropriate place to look at how they've performed in terms of expenditure management would be in your statement of budget versus actual figures, where we can see for PRASA for the 24-25 financial year, there was actually a budget for general expenditure of 5.4 billion, and they ended up spending 4.3 billion. So from that perspective, we have been noting that there are quite strict measures that are being taken to try and curtail expenditure in light of going concern issues and fiscal constraints. So I think from that perspective, at least that evidences that there are some measures that are being taken, even though there was an increase year on year in terms of actual spending, that there are measures in place to try and curtail the expenditure that is then incurred by the entity. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. So may I, so what I'd ask, I'm just, there's a note to the Secretariat team that we ask PRASA to provide us with a list of the irregular expenditures as shown in slide 6. So just to tell us which basically the process of closing off on that, where it is. So they must tell us the breakdown, must give us a breakdown, tell us the amounts, tell us where the process is, and including consequence management where it is applicable. So that is the one. The second thing is the irregular expenditure under assessment. We will need more detail with that. That is at the bottom left of slide 6. So if we can just put that on the list of things to request PRASA to provide. So that's the, then we do the same in terms of the following slide. That is slide 7. And then I just wanted to then we must ask them to tell us where each of those vacancies, the recruitment on those vacancies is. So can we please do that? Let's put it in the letter that we are going to send to PRASA. And then I wanted to just ask the final question. So the last time, and I just want to know your assessment. I'm just telling you where we ended up in our previous discussion with PRASA, and then you can comment. So the last time we met with them, the rolling stock, sorry, forget the old one, the one that's being refurbished. I mean the blue trains, the new trains, the Gibela trains. There was a problem in that they are being produced at a certain rate per month. PRASA is not able to take them on and put them on the rails because they don't have the signaling equipment that they need. There's obviously an investment in that process, but that was not happening fast enough to accommodate all the trains. There was then a developing problem of the trains that get produced by Gibela not having a storage place, firstly, and secondly, if they just stand there, they start degrading. And then, as I understand, there have been issues with some of the contracts, and if any, that is the signaling contracts. And if any of those contracts are held up, they exacerbate the problem on the side of the Gibela trains. So that was our understanding of the issues at the time. I just want, some general observations from you, because on this terrain here, because that appeared to indicate that there might be more serious problems down the line. I just want your general observations on that area.
Ilse, can I ask that you come in, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Corneille, and thank you, Honourable Chairperson. So, Chair, you are indeed correct. So I think the short answer to this is yes, the problems are in the process of getting addressed, but it's not yet fully addressed. So in terms of signalling, there's been some progress. There has been some signalling restored. I think it's on one or two, and we can come back in terms of the details, but I know it's 1 or 2 lines in Gauteng and then also in the Western Cape, where we recently saw the signalling now being restored and the train frequency increasing. And if I'm not mistaken, those are on the kind of priority lines in Gauteng and the Western Cape. But the signalling is still probably the golden bullet that's going to result in these trains then moving as they are supposed to. So that is ongoing, and I think the entity will be able to give the accurate current status. But from the audit process, what we've observed is there has been progress, but there's a long way to go. Then in terms of the new trains, in terms of just the storage and the maintenance, so because of the fact that these trains cannot be used with that ultimate regularity yet, what we've noted is that there are some rotation of the utilization on the trains on the track, so which then allows for intervals to maintain the trains without then compromising the maintenance regime. But the storage situation is an ongoing matter that is receiving consideration and being addressed by the entity. It is not fully resolved yet in terms of the depot modernization program and where that is at. Perhaps to note is that there are negotiations and ongoing negotiations which even took effect in the previous financial year to try and then secure a reduction in the train production, just to align with both the budgetary elements as well as then to try and do a better match-up in terms of the infrastructure recovery. But I think PRASA will also just be in a better position to completely articulate that. But we are aware that there's ongoing negotiations. I think there's a meeting scheduled for the end of March to then conclude on potential reduction in terms of the manufacturing of the new trains. Thank you very much, Honourable Chairperson.
All right, thank you very much. Can I then also to Secretariat just ask that we just ask for a comprehensive update from PRASA on this. Ultimately, we have to be able to tell whether the rate between the signaling equipment installation and the installation of the trains onto tracks and the production are going at a similar speed. They had a slide that they used last time that showed how the switchover was supposed to happen over time. So we just need to ask for an update on that. Can we then do this? We will then have the special investigating unit next, and then we have PRASA next. May I ask the team from the AG to be present on that day, physically in the meeting? There are just a couple of things we need to straighten out together with PRASA, so that we're all on the same page. Because also what happens is that when they come with their update, they obviously close the gap between the close of the audit and now. So there's typically kind of information asymmetry between the two periods. So if we can do that. But the dates will be communicated to the Auditor General team as soon as possible. Other members, I just want to ask if there are any further questions for the team. Okay. All right. No, thank you very much. I wish to thank the team from the AG for the presentation and
apologies, Chair.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Sorry, I was battling with my mute button.
Yes.
Greetings to yourself and the AG team. Chair, I just want just a quick question. There's been all over the news. There's issues about PRASA or senior PRASA employees being associated with street gangs in Cape Town. I just wanted to know, does the AG team know anything about that? Because it seems to have a very huge and a very negative impact on the functioning of PRASA's rail lines, especially in the Western Cape. Does the AG team know anything about that?
No, that's a straight. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. Thank you, Honourable Member. My colleagues can come in, but from where I'm sitting, I'm not aware of any direct link there with the street gangs that has been mentioned. No, so from our side, no, we're not aware. Thank you.
Okay, no, I'm just asking, Chair, because the amounts that are being stated that are being funneled to and through these mafia type gangsters in Cape Town, they are phenomenal amounts. And I don't think it sits very well. It looks good for an entity such as PRASA that is supposed to be coming out of a very dark period to now be associated with gang bosses and drug lords and things like that. But it's fine. I think, Chair, I'll pose the question to the executive at PRASA when they come and see us. Thank you.
No, thanks, Honorable Kubeka. It's on the list for me of things that we need them to address. I noted that article. I just thought that I think it was Amapungane. It was fairly comprehensive, and I thought that they would be best placed because I would expect that there is an investigation since the revelations, first of all, and that any affected employees, there is some step that is being taken at the very least. So I saw that. That news report, Honorable Kubeka, and they need to account for it when we meet with them.
No, they do, Chair. They do. Well, we'll ask that. Thank you, Chair.
All right. No, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Thanks very much, honorable members, and thank you to the team from the Auditor General. We will then see each other when PRASA appears before the committee. Like I said, I would appreciate it if you came, because there's just some detailed information that we need to work through together with PRASA, and then just ask, and that information will relate to the issues that you've reported on, so that we are on the same page as to the meaning of some of that information. Obviously, there is a management accounting authority responsibility, and then there are the observations of the AG in terms of the audit. So thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you, Chairperson, and we'll await the invite. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Bye.
Recording stopped.